35 million pills. That was the quantity shipped to the front lines. The Nazi machine promised an invincible soldier, sleepless, fearless. Commanders distributed Pervitin to the troops before every major attack. Men swallowed the methamphetamine to stay awake for 3 days straight. What was the cost of this energy? It looked like strength, but it was chemical psychosis. The drug turned disciplined units into packs of wolves. At first glance, a super soldier, but in reality, a monster. Inhibitions disappeared. Paranoia set in. The aggression did not stop at the battlefield. It spilled into the villages. Women across occupied Europe paid the price. The footage shows trembling hands and dilated pupils. Soldiers kicked down doors in the middle of the night. Families were torn apart. The assaults were brutal and frantic. Victims were left broken in the wake of the advance. This was not just war. It was a drug-fueled crime wave. The scars lasted for generations. The full truth is darker than the history books admit. 1937, Berlin. At that precise moment, the Third Reich demanded total efficiency. Germany was not just rebuilding, it was accelerating. Factories operated around the clock. The noise of machinery never stopped. Schools pushed students to their physical limits, and the military drilled for a conflict that was inevitable. In this atmosphere of exhaustion, the Temmler Company unveiled a solution, a small tube filled with white pills. They called it Pervitin. What was actually inside the packaging? The label promised alertness, but the chemical formula revealed pure methamphetamine. Most citizens did not understand the chemistry. They only felt the result. One pill dissolved fatigue instantly. It replaced exhaustion with a cold, aggressive energy. It created a dangerous illusion of invincibility. At first glance, a harmless supplement, but in reality, a hard narcotic available to everyone. Pharmacies sold it without restriction. It sat on shelves next to cough syrup and aspirin. Housewives took it to manage households, cleaning floors and cooking meals until the early hours of the morning. The sound of scrubbing brushes did not cease. University students swallowed tablets to study through the night, their eyes wide and unblinking. Archival newspapers show advertisements feature smiling, radiant women. They look fresh. They look capable of anything. The addiction spread to every sector. Police clerks typed reports with manic speed. Truck drivers gripped their steering wheels, hauling cargo across the country without stopping for sleep. Doctors prescribed it freely. There were no regulations. There was only the demand for performance. It seemed like a miracle. The drug hit the nervous system immediately. Hunger vanished completely. A rush of chemical confidence flooded the brain. A factory worker felt powerful. A mother felt efficient. The German people believed they had unlocked the secret to endless productivity, but the biology demanded payment. The come-down was brutal. Hands shook uncontrollably. Irritability turned into rage. Paranoia crept into the minds of loyal citizens. Yet these warning signs were dismissed. The goal was output, not health. And this artificial stamina did not go unnoticed by the highest powers. The Wehrmacht took interest. 1938. That year marked a turning point for the German military. Doctors started experimenting with a new chemical on the troops. The results were immediate. Men who usually collapsed after a long march suddenly kept walking. They moved for hours without stopping. Fatigue vanished. Fear dissolved. Their focus sharpened into a cold stare. Why did the Nazi leadership embrace this drug? They were preparing for rapid invasions, but the human body required sleep. Pervitin was the answer to that biological flaw. Germany planned lightning-fast attacks. Soldiers needed to move day and night without rest. In 1939, the army officially ordered millions of tablets. The supply lines filled up. September came. The invasion of Poland began. Soldiers carried the drug in their pockets next to their ammunition. Before a sudden night battle, they swallowed the pills. Reports from the front stunned the generals. Entire units moved without food or sleep for nearly 2 days straight. The footage shows soldiers with wide eyes and rigid faces marching mechanically through the mud. It was not just for the infantry. Officers took it. Pilots used it to fly longer missions. SS guards consumed it regularly to stay alert. At first glance, a miracle weapon, but in reality, a chemical trap. There was no turning back. The cost was hidden but severe. The drug erased hunger and fear. But it also destroyed basic human restraint. Emotions dulled. Aggression took over. Many lost the ability to feel pity or guilt. For the men who swallowed the white pills, exhaustion disappeared, but morality vanished with it. And in the occupied territories, women would pay the heaviest price for this addiction. May 10th, 1940. The clock started ticking. Hitler unleashed the Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was not a slow tactical maneuver, it was an avalanche. German panzer divisions tore across the borders, crushing fences and road signs. The sky went black with Stuka dive bombers. The sound of sirens pierced the air. Soldiers advanced at a velocity that defied military logic. The world watched in shock. British and French defenders collapsed from fatigue. Their eyes were heavy, their limbs felt like lead. But the Germans kept coming. Why were the invaders unstoppable? It seemed like superhuman endurance, but the secret was chemical. Pervitin, methamphetamine in a small tube. Behind the strategic genius was a simple white pill. The Wehrmacht pushed deep into French territory, Sedan, Abbeville, Amiens. The footage shows smoke rising from medieval town squares. In the frame, abandoned bicycles and shattered windows. Most local men were gone. They were either dead on the front lines or marching into prisoner of war camps. Who remained? Women, children, the elderly, they were defenseless. At first glance, a conquered population waiting for occupation. But in reality, prey waiting for predators. The German troops arrived with dilated pupils and grinding teeth. They were high. The drug erased empathy. It replaced exhaustion with aggressive mania. They did not just fight opposing armies. They turned their chemical rage against the civilians. The hunger for power was insatiable. Panic spread through the villages. Women realized the danger immediately. They locked doors. They barricaded shutters. Some ran to the forests, clutching infants to their chests, carrying only bread and water. Others huddled in cold basements, listening to heavy boots on the floorboards above. They prayed for the noise to pass. But there was no escape. Soldiers, restless and twitching from the stimulants, forced their way in. Wood splintered, glass shattered. They kicked down the doors and stormed the rooms. Mothers were dragged out by their hair while their children screamed in the corners. There was no mercy. Not for young daughters, not for elderly grandmothers. For the soldiers fueled by Pervitin, limits did not exist. The pill banished fatigue and provided a twisted, frantic strength. The assaults lasted for hours. Women were left broken on the floor, terrified, bleeding. For many, survival meant silence. They washed the blood from their clothes. They buried the trauma. They carried scars that no X-ray could show. But the truth survived. After the war, the reports finally emerged. French authorities investigated the ruins of towns like Abbeville. They found that entire families had been destroyed, not by aerial bombs, not by artillery fire, but by the soldiers who passed through. The files were closed. September 1st, 1939. On this date, the German war machine crossed the border. Poland did not just fall, it shattered. The country collapsed within weeks. The Polish army fought with desperation. They held lines and fired until their ammunition ran dry. But bravery was not enough against tanks and aircraft. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. The fighting stopped. The silence did not last. The occupation began immediately. Daily life transformed into a survival horror. For the civilian population, the streets became traps. For women, the danger was absolute. Why was the cruelty so unhinged? It wasn't just hatred, it was chemistry. SS officers, Gestapo agents, and regular infantry patrolled the sectors. Many had dilated pupils, their veins pumped with Pervitin. The methamphetamine made them restless. It stripped away fatigue. It erased empathy. Any restraint vanished. The drug turned soldiers into predators. In Krakow, Warsaw, and Lublin, the nights offered no safety. Raids became routine. The footage records, splintered doors, and overturned furniture. German squads burst into apartments. They claimed to hunt for weapons. They claimed to look for resistance fighters or Jewish families. But the agenda was often different. The targets were women, young girls, mothers, even grandmothers. No one was exempt. Soldiers dragged them out in front of screaming fathers and husbands. Sometimes the trucks took them to police stations, other times to makeshift barracks established in hollowed-out schools or cold warehouses. Most never returned the same. At first glance, a military logistics center. But in reality, a system of organized abuse. The command structure built something chilling. They established field brothels across the occupied territories. These were not voluntary establishments. They were prisons. Women were conscripted like supplies. Many were Polish locals. Others were trafficked from neighboring regions. Some were merely teenagers. At night, the buildings came alive with terror. Residents nearby heard the sounds through thin walls. Screams, sobbing, the heavy boots of soldiers marching up the stairs. The men on Pervitin never seemed to tire. Inside the rooms, there was no escape. But the horror was not confined to these walls. The streets remained hostile territory. Patrols stopped women without cause. Soldiers forced them to carry ammunition crates or scrub barracks floors until their hands bled. Others disappeared under the pretense of interrogation. Families tried to intervene. Fathers stood in doorways. Brothers raised fists. The response was lethal. A single protest could doom an entire household. Soldiers, high on methamphetamines, acted without hesitation. They burned homes. They executed defenders on the spot. Mercy was not part of the occupation. June 22nd, 1941. At exactly 3:15 in the morning, the artillery fire began. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers crossed the border into the Soviet Union. To fuel this massive attack, the German High Command issued a specific order. They demanded millions of Pervitin tablets. These were not vitamins, they were methamphetamine. The pills were packed into soldiers' kits. They sat right next to ammunition. They sat right next to daily rations. Why poison the army? The goal was unnatural speed. The generals wanted men to stay awake for days, to march hundreds of kilometers without sleep, to strike without a single pause. The invasion was brutal from the first second. Luftwaffe planes bombed cities into rubble. Panzer tanks rolled over wheat fields. Wooden villages burned to the ground. The smell of smoke and gasoline covered the horizon. But behind the battle lines, another war began. One directed specifically at women. In Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia, civilians faced a new nightmare. Soviet women became the primary targets. At first glance, a disciplined military force, but in reality, a horde of armed addicts. Soldiers, restless and wired on high doses of meth, stormed into rural settlements. Their aggression was endless. They kicked down doors. They dragged women from their homes. They pulled them out of cellars and hiding places. The footage describes the aftermath. Barns, stables, and abandoned huts turned into crime scenes. Mercy did not exist. Some women were killed on the spot, often immediately after being assaulted. Others were tied up. They were taken away as prisoners. They were forced to march with the army columns or locked in makeshift camps behind barbed wire. With Pervitin coursing through their veins, the soldiers did not slow down. Fatigue was chemically erased. But this was only the beginning. Soviet records collected after the war revealed the truth. The violence was systemic. In Belarus alone, reports flooded in. Entire villages stated that their female population had been brutalized. In Ukraine, rural communities were left shattered. Families were destroyed, children were left orphaned in the ashes. Numbers are hard to confirm. But historians agree on the scale. It was massive. The abuse touched hundreds of thousands of women across the entire Eastern Front. By 1942, the Nazi system of control had fully spread. 1940. The German war machine rolled across Europe, and with it, a new kind of infrastructure appeared. Tanks and artillery were not the only tools of the occupation. Behind the front lines, the Wehrmacht established a vast network of military brothels. These were not hidden back alley establishments. They were state-sponsored institutions. They appeared in occupied Poland. They opened in France. Later, they spread deep into the frozen territories of the Soviet Union. Even inside the concentration camps, engineers constructed special barracks for this specific purpose. At first glance, a system to boost morale and maintain soldier discipline, but in reality, a factory of industrialized rape. The command stated these places were a reward for loyalty, a biological necessity. But the foundation was built entirely on coercion. The women inside never volunteered. Soldiers conducted sweep operations in rural villages. SS officers walked the lines in prison camps pointing fingers. They promised lighter work, peeling potatoes in a kitchen, sewing uniforms in a factory. But this was only the beginning. The moment the transport truck stopped, the trap snapped shut. Many of the victims were barely out of childhood, teenagers. One day they were harvesting wheat in a field. The next, they were locked in a room with barred windows. There was no key. There was no way out. Why was the violence so extreme? It wasn't just cruelty, it was chemistry. The soldiers and SS guards rarely entered these rooms sober. They consumed Pervitin, methamphetamine. The drug stripped away empathy and removed physical fatigue. For the women, this meant the nights did not end. A soldier on Pervitin did not sleep. He did not stop. The women were forced to endure assault after assault until their bodies simply gave out. The archives describe the scene: overcrowded rooms, peeling paint, and the smell of stale alcohol and blood. Sanitation was non-existent. Syphilis spread like wildfire. Gonorrhea infections went untreated. If a woman became pregnant, there was no mercy. Forced abortions were performed without anesthesia on dirty tables, or worse. The guards did not tolerate weakness. If a woman resisted, the rifle butt came down. If she could no longer work, she was removed. It got worse. The turnover rate was calculated in months. Researchers estimate the average survival time of a woman trapped in these units: less than 1 year. They did not retire. They died. Exhaustion broke their minds. Infection destroyed their bodies. Violence finished the rest. For thousands of these prisoners, death was not a tragedy. It was a release. The suffering finally stopped. 1939. The Nazi war machine required a new kind of prison. Most camps were built for men, but Ravensbrück was different. It was constructed exclusively to hold women. Located north of Berlin, it became the largest female concentration camp in the Reich. Over the next 6 years, more than 130,000 women passed through its iron gates. They arrived in cattle cars from Poland, the Soviet Union, France, and Germany. Who were they? Some were political dissidents, others were Jewish citizens. Many were simply civilians caught in the crossfire of the occupation. But inside the wire, distinctions vanished. For the SS guards, every woman was a target. Why was the cruelty in Ravensbrück so relentless? It seemed to go beyond standard orders, but chemistry played a role. The guards consumed Pervitin regularly. The pills eliminated the need for sleep. Fatigue disappeared. It was replaced by a chemically induced aggression that demanded release. At first glance, a disciplined facility, but in reality, an unpredictable zone of terror. Women in the camp learned quickly that safety was an illusion. There was no quiet hour. The sound of shouting echoed through the barracks 24 hours a day. Beatings were not punishments for rules broken. They were symptoms of the guards' drug-fueled mania. A prisoner could be struck down while sleeping. Random violence became the only routine. But this was only the beginning. The regime demanded labor. From the moment the sun rose, the prisoners were mobilized. Some marched to nearby Siemens factories. They stitched uniforms for the Wehrmacht or assembled electrical components for V-2 rockets. Others remained outside. They hauled rocks. They dug drainage ditches in the freezing mud without coats or gloves. The cold turned fingers black. Rations were calculated to starve. A bowl of watery soup, a slice of stale bread. Hunger became a physical pain, gnawing at their stomachs. The footage shows skeletal figures struggling to lift heavy shovels. When a woman collapsed from exhaustion, there was no medical aid. The guards, their eyes dilated from methamphetamine, responded with violence. Boots struck ribs, rifle butts cracked bone. Physical weakness was treated as sabotage. Events accelerated. The camp also served as a site of systemic sexual violence. Officers viewed the inmates as property. Some women were selected during morning roll call. They were forced into camp brothels, organized to motivate male prisoners from neighboring camps. Others faced assaults in the shadows of the barracks. Silence was enforced with a pistol to the temple. There was no police to call. There was no safe corner to hide. But the abuse of the body was not enough for the doctors on site. Medical experiments began. Biological limits. That was what the Nazi doctors wanted to find. Medical experiments became a second layer of hell for women in the camps. The doctors did not see patients. They saw raw material. The weapon of choice was Pervitin, an early form of methamphetamine. The goal was not to cure. The goal was to break the human machine. Why did they choose young women? It seemed random, but the regime needed to test how far a healthy body could be pushed before it snapped. There was no consent. Guards dragged prisoners from the barracks. Needles were inserted. High doses of the stimulant flooded their veins. Then the torture began. Women were ordered to stay awake. 24 hours turned into 48. If a prisoner's eyes closed, the response was instant. Beatings followed. Buckets of freezing water were thrown over shivering bodies. The doctors stood by with stopwatches. They measured exactly how long a brain could function without sleep. Other experiments focused on physical exhaustion. At first glance, hard labor, but in reality, a chemical stress test. Dosed with meth, women were forced to carry heavy granite stones. They ran in circles until their muscles tore. The drug masked the pain. They moved until the heart gave out or the legs collapsed completely. There was no mercy. Doctors introduced cocktails of other drugs alongside the meth to observe the chemical clash. The reactions were violent. Some women vomited uncontrollably. Others suffered massive seizures on the concrete floor. When the subject was no longer useful, the experiment ended. A lethal injection or a bullet finished the job. The bodies were immediately moved to dissection tables for analysis. The archives show neat rows of handwritten data, pulse rates, time of death, drug dosage, but the names were missing. To the Nazis, these women were just numbers on a clipboard. Families never received answers. Most victims vanished without a trace. But the network of camps continued to expand. The tracks led to the largest killing center of all, Auschwitz. 1.1 million people. That was the human cost of Auschwitz. It stood as the ultimate symbol of Nazi terror. Jews, Poles, Roma, and Soviet prisoners vanished behind its gates. But in this factory of constant death, Pervitin was more than just a stimulant. It was a tool of industrial-scale murder. Why did the SS need chemical assistance? The work of genocide required 24-hour attention, but human endurance had limits. Pervitin erased those limits. Commanders distributed the pills before long shifts, before mass shootings, before the gas chambers sealed shut. The drug kept the guards awake, but it did something worse. It cauterized their empathy. It turned men into functioning mechanisms. The archives confirm guard rotations became endless. But the violence escalated after sunset. Women in Auschwitz faced the darkest manifestation of this chemical rage. At first glance, a barracks at rest. but in reality, a hunting ground. Guards, their pupils dilated from methamphetamine, kicked down the doors of the female blocks. They didn't speak. They stormed in. Women were dragged from their bunks by their hair. The selection was often random, but frequently the predators targeted the most vulnerable, the youngest, the weakest, those who could not physically fight back. Mercy was absent. Pregnant women, teenagers, and even children were pulled out into the freezing night. Some were dragged to secluded areas behind the latrines. Others were thrown into the concrete cells of the punishment blocks. The abuse was physical and relentless. Many never returned to their bunks. Survivor testimony records the aftermath. Those who returned were often too broken to stand at roll call. In Auschwitz, weakness meant death. The next morning, trucks took them straight to the gas chambers. The cruelty, fueled by synthetic stimulants, created a self-sustaining cycle of torment. But this method did not stay behind the wire. It moved to new territories. September 8, 1943. On this date, the alliance broke. Italy surrendered to the Allies, but peace did not follow. Instead, the Wehrmacht reacted with lightning speed. German convoys reversed direction and flooded the peninsula. Troops occupied Tuscany, Lazio, and Emilia-Romagna within days. For Italian women, this was not just a military occupation. It was the start of a calculated nightmare. Why was the violence so extreme? It wasn't just anger, it was chemistry. Reports confirmed that soldiers consumed Pervitin tablets like daily rations. The drug stripped away empathy and left only aggression. Women fled to barn cellars and forests. But the searches were systematic. Soldiers kicked down doors. They overturned furniture. The footage shows empty houses with meals left half-eaten on tables. Once found, there was no mercy. Soldiers dragged victims into town squares. At first glance, a security sweep. But in reality, a chaotic purge. They did not care about witnesses. Fathers and husbands were forced to watch at gunpoint. The sound of weeping filled the streets. Some victims were executed immediately after. A bullet to the head ensured silence. Others were left broken in ditches or open fields. But this was only the beginning. The damage went beyond the physical. In a single night, grandmothers, mothers, and daughters faced the same terror. The violence shattered the social structure of entire villages. Survivors locked the memories away. Silence became a survival mechanism. For decades, no one spoke of the crimes. The scars remained on the identity of the towns, invisible but permanent. 1944. The fronts collapsed. The Third Reich began to crumble under pressure from the West and the Soviets in the East. But the retreat brought no relief. It brought escalation. German units moved through East Prussia, Poland, and Hungary. Desperation replaced discipline. Soldiers were starving. Their uniforms were tattered. To keep moving, they tripled their dosage of Pervitin. The drug kept them awake for 3 days straight, but it also induced paranoia and rage. Soviet and Polish women became targets of opportunity. Attacks happened daily. Reports describe refugees strafed on the roads. Women tried to flee into the woods, but the soldiers tracked them down. Exhaustion meant nothing when fueled by meth. They dragged victims from farmhouses. They attacked them in the snow. Many villages were wiped out entirely. No witnesses remained to accuse the perpetrators. Liberation came too late for thousands. They died before the first Allied tank appeared on the horizon. Their stories were buried in the mud with them. The Reich fell, but the meth kept the cruelty alive until the final second. 1945. The cannons finally went cold. But for millions of women, the nightmare persisted. They walked out of the ruins, but they carried the war with them. Why did they stay silent? The trauma was too heavy to share. They locked the memories away. At first glance, the fighting was over, but in reality, their bodies were still broken. Medical reports from the time list untreated fractures, burns, and chronic infections. The footage shows survivors hiding their faces from the newsreel cameras. It was a lifetime sentence. Governments signed peace treaties. The world celebrated recovery. But in the quiet of their homes, the pain returned every night. For them, the war never ended.